probably never have seen the birth of a giraffe. Me neither, but I read about it, and it's pretty cool how it happens. Obviously, it's a long drop from that mama to the ground. She doesn't lay down. She gives birth standing up. It's about a 10-feet drop. And so when she gives birth to that baby, she allows it to lay there just for a few minutes, and then she goes over with her swift, powerful foot and kicks it. She kicks it hard as it goes tumbling head over heels, and then she's trying to get it to arouse up a little bit. And so a few minutes later, she walks over to it. He can't get up. He's trying to get up. He can't get up on those stilts, those God-given stilts, if you can imagine standing up on that right after you've given birth. He can't get up. She goes over to it. She gives him another swift kick, sends him tumbling again. And finally, he begins to stand up. He gets it. Mom wants me to stand up. And so I begin to stand up, that baby giraffe does, and he stands up and he begins to walk around a little bit, and he's still wobbly. And the craziest thing happens. Mama giraffe walks over to him, and she kicks him and knocks him down. And she does that. She does that so he will understand, I got to get up fast. I got to survive in this wild. I've got to be able to get back on my feet very, very quickly. I can relate to that baby giraffe. I've been kicked off my feet before. I've been kicked while I was down. And I've been kicked by the very ones from whom I expected kindness. Maybe you can relate. All of us have moments we're carrying on with our life, working out our plan, trying to keep up and trying to keep our head above water, and we get sideswiped by circumstances or sidelined by some harsh person. And so how we respond in those moments reveals the truth about what we really believe about God. My response is crucial when something like that happens in my life, and it profoundly affects both my inner and outer world. And so this morning, we're going to drop in on Joseph of the Old Testament when he's about 17 years old. And as we open Genesis 37, Joseph's life is good and his future looks bright, but he's about to be kicked off his feet. He's about to be kicked hard while he's down. And the ones who are doing the kicking are his own family. But somehow, some way, Joseph managed to avoid the very thing that consumed his brothers, the emotional stronghold of bitterness. We've all had bitterness in our lives. We've all been bitter about something. So we're going to understand how Joseph was able to overcome that. Somehow, as he faced this trauma and this hijacking of his dreams without becoming bitter, it's an amazing story. But for his brothers, it's a very different story. There's something deep here for all of us. And I want you to go with me right now to scene 1. And that is the emotional matchstick of jealousy. Just this little match, just this little bitty thing that starts a fire. And that's what happens, the emotional matchstick of jealousy. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31 commands us, get rid, throw out, trash, remove all bitterness. It doesn't say play with it a little while and then get rid of it. It doesn't say keep it and maybe you'll work through it. It says get rid of it. Throw it away like you throw your trash away. The word for bitterness literally refers to something that is so acrid and so poisonous that it blisters and kills those who possess it. Biblically, bitterness is anger that has seethed until it hardens into a rebellious, vengeful conclusion. An unforgiving spirit takes over. It lets anger control you. And anger over circumstances, anger over your spouse, anger at your children, anger at your employee, anger at your friend, and you fill in the blank, whoever you're angry at. And anger is embraced and coddled and rehearsed over and over and over, and all the while, quietly it takes over your life. And there are people like that everywhere. Maybe you feel entitled to hate someone. Maybe you feel justified to desire their ruin. I hope they mess up. I hope they fall. I hope this happens to them. And you're energized to seek their very downfall. But I want you to take a look at the primary fuel that lit an inferno of vengeance toward Joseph. It's one simple word, jealousy. Jealousy. What did these guys have to be jealous about? Well, first of all, they had to be jealous about his relationship. They were jealous about his relationship. Look in chapter 37, verse 1. Now Jacob, that's Joseph's dad, whose name was changed to Israel, Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. Joseph was loved by Israel, by Jacob, more than anybody else, more than all of his sons. Why? The Bible says, because he was the son of his old age. He was the son of his old age. When his brothers saw that, their father loved Joseph more than they loved them. They, the Bible says, hated him. They hated him. They couldn't even peaceably speak to him. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. There are several other things that contribute to this. Joseph was Rachel's firstborn. You remember that story last week? Joseph and Rachel and Jacob's firstborn, the only child Rachel was able to have, was Joseph. And then she had Benjamin, and she died in childbirth. And so Jacob, his most beloved wife, remember he had 4? His most beloved wife was Rachel. So it goes without saying his most beloved son was Rachel's son, Joseph. Rightly or wrongly, Jacob cherished Joseph in ways that he hadn't shown to his other sons. And Joseph was hated for it. So tell me, is there someone in your life who has a quality of relationship that you lack and it's eating you? Somebody that's done something better than you, more than you, and you can't get to that level and it's eating you alive. Jealousy. Every time you think about that person, this bile begins to rise in you. You get angry and you see. Hear me. You're on your way to bitterness. Jealousy leads to bitterness. They were also jealous of his position. His position, verse 3, the last part says, he made him a tunic, a robe of many colors. Every child that hangs around church long enough is going to hear the story about the coat of many colors. But there's a backstory to this fancy tunic that you need to know. Back in Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, we're told that Reuben, the oldest son, lay with Bilhah, his father's wife. His father's concubine, we would call her today. But because of Reuben's gross immorality, because he had an adulterous relationship with his stepmother, he lost not only his father's favor, the firstborn got all kinds of rights and all kinds of inheritance. He lost all that. And he lost his birthrights as the firstborn son. So here's what happened. The Bible makes it clear that Jacob exercised his fatherly privilege. And he appoints his firstborn son by Rachel as his heir. So Reuben was removed. He skips all the other 9 sons and he selects the youngest at the time. The symbol of the birthright happened to be a special tunic. The Hebrew word in verse 3 used to describe this coat or tunic is that was richly ornamented. But the most important detail the Hebrew gives is that it was long-sleeved. And it went down to Joseph's ankles. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, the tunics worn by the working men in that day were sleeveless. And they cut off at the knees so they could do work with their arms and their legs. So a long-sleeved, tailored garment, adorned, was worn by a manager, someone who had been put in charge and therefore was exempt from working. Maybe you have a manager like that you work with. They're exempt from working. So, I'm glad one of you got it. So the coat was a symbol of position. Position. When Joseph's brothers saw him in that coat, they saw him coming, and the hatred began to bubble up. He's given him the heir. He has given him preeminence over us. He is Daddy's choice to receive the inheritance. So, did somebody else get a promotion you were in line for, and you're ticked off about it? Somebody else get elected to some position of influence at your job or at a club or whatever, and you're not happy about it. Your feelings are hurt. Bitterness is stalking you. But thirdly, they were jealous of God's favor. They were jealous of God's favor. Look down at verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Can you imagine going to your brothers and tell them a dream, and after you tell them, they hate your guts, basically. They hate you. Joseph had this dream, and they hated him. Look at verse 6. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood still, stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words." Joseph tells his brothers that he dreamed about them. They were all in this field, binding sheaves of grain, and suddenly one sheaf arose and the others bowed down. You know the story. You don't have to be a psychoanalyst to figure out this dream, the meaning of it. But look at verse number 9. Again, something happens. Then he dreamed still another dream. And he told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, the 11 stars bowed down to me." And so he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So Joseph says, "I had another dream. Not only did these sheaves bow down before me, but this time there's some different symbols. Same meaning. They bowed down. His dad heard Joseph's dream and he thought it was a joke. Are we really going to come and bow down to you, Joseph? His brothers didn't think it was a joke at all. Verse 11 reports that his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this in mind. He kept thinking about it. Here's the point. If your little brother tells you about a crazy dream he has, you might poke fun at him. You might ignore him. But you don't get jealous of him. Unless, that is, you really believe God is speaking through my little brother. Then there's a reason to be jealous. They really believed that one day Joseph's dream would come true. They believed that God was speaking through their younger brother. There's no other reason to be jealous of a dream like that. You ever feel like someone has a hotline with God and you're missing out on it? I mean, this person has this great relationship with God and you're missing out on it. They tell about how God's worked in their life. They tell about this passage that's meant so much to their life. They tell about their powerful prayer life. They're the ones that people turn to for counsel. They're the ones that are teaching a class. And inside you, there's this quiet desire to see them knocked off their pedestal. I'm tired of so-and-so being so religious, so spiritual. Then bitterness has your number. For Joseph's brothers, self-pity and jealousy and anger finally pushed them over the dangerous line. So here's what's going on. They were mad at their father for his favoritism. They were mad at God for the good things that were coming to their brother and not to them. And there was only one way to get back at them both. And that is this. They would take away the darling object of affection, Joseph. We got to do something with Joseph. That's scene 2. The inferno of bitterness. It was just a matchstick. Now it's this inferno that's building, that's bubbling, that's boiling over. Look at verse 12. The inferno of bitterness. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." So he said to them, "Here I am." And then he said to him, please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. And so he sent him out to the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was wandering in the field, and a man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? Joseph was lost, and he didn't know how to ask for directions. That doesn't say that. We read that into the Scripture because he was a man. Verse 16, so he said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. I often wondered, how did they know that was Joseph? I mean, they saw him way off, this guy walking toward them. How did they know it was Joseph? And then it hit me one day. Maybe the sun was glaring off his jewels on his robe. And they said, oh, there comes Joseph. Verse 19, they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore and let us now kill him. Can you imagine that thought? Let's just kill him. And let's cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard it, the oldest. He delivered him out of their hands and said, let's not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. He was going to come back and rescue him. Verse 23, so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. So, those verses tell us how it all came down. Following his father's instructions, Joseph tracked down his brothers, and he goes and finds them. They were shepherding the flocks. It took about 5 days for him to find them. He finally finds them. When they see him far off, they conspire to kill him. So Reuben intervenes, and you see all that going on in your mind. You can see the scene in your mind if you'll think about Joseph approaches, wearing that tunic that's so offensive, and calling out to them, hey, and he's calling out their names. All at once they fell upon him. They strip him of his coat, of his robe, and they throw him head first into a hole. Into an old well, basically. A pit. There was no water in it. It was a dried out well. The dark deed was done. They think he'll never get out. We're about to walk away with their sheep. No one will ever find him. He'll die here in this hole. That's the end of him. But verse 25 tells us that something happened. Look what it says there. And they sat down to eat a meal. Are you kidding? We just threw him in this hole. He's in there screaming. And we're going to eat. We're going to eat. They have no regard whatsoever for Joseph. Now, nothing is said here in chapter 37 about the complaints of Joseph. We don't hear him screaming, hey, help. We don't see that. But we do see that in Genesis chapter 42, 22 years later. You know that story probably. The brothers remembered this moment, and they confessed to Joseph about that. It says this, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. We went over here and ate and left him there in the pit. And as Joseph wept aloud and begged to be spared, they ate their meal of malice and they drank their drink of deception, and the hatred began to boil over in their hearts, and they found this desire to not even care. Had these men arrested sin when it first began to grow in their hearts, this whole episode would have been avoided, but they didn't. They didn't do that. They allowed dislike to grow into full-blown hatred and desire for murder, and the true nature of these men is fully on display in these verses. First, they have their desire in their hearts to kill him. They hate him so much, let's kill him. Let's put him to death and get rid of him, and we'll go on with our life. Dad will pick somebody else to be in charge. Somebody else will be the heir, and we'll go on. Now, when they call him the word the dreamer, they're not being brotherly. They're not showing brotherly love. Okay, they're not being kind to him. They're making fun of him. They're so calloused that they want to kill him and toss him into a pit. They even devised a plan to cover up their deed. They believe they can derail Joseph's dreams if they can just kill him. But these men have no concept whatsoever of the sovereign power of God. Now, get this picture, if you will, for a second. Isn't that what happened to Jesus? the people he came to save, rejected him. They hated him. They mocked him. They rejected his message. They wanted to kill him. They believed that killing him would put an end to his message, and boy, were they wrong. Oh, they saw him die, but they couldn't see that his death would accomplish more than his life. They couldn't see that his 3 days later, he's up. So these brothers didn't see the sovereign hand of God working in Joseph either. To make their revenge even more tasty, it just so happened that a certain caravan of merchants was coming by. Not only could they rid themselves of Joseph once for all, they decided, let's make a little money off of brother, the dreamer. And so they sold him into slavery. Now, we're about to read this passage, but I want you to note before we read it, because it's very interesting. 2 terms are listed to describe these merchants. The Midianites, which defines where they were from Midian, and the Ishmaelites. They're called both. Ishmaelites defines their family heritage. Remember who Ishmael is? They were actually in the lineage of Abraham's son Ishmael by his slave Hagar, which would have never come to be if Abraham had been obedient to God. It's carried down to Joseph. Look at verse 25 again. They sat down to eat a meal. They lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill him and conceal his blood? Let's sell him. Judah thought of this one. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. Finally, some sense is going on here. Let's not let him die. And then verse 28, the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. And they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Judah convinces his brothers, let's not kill him, let's make a little bit of money off of him. 20 pieces of silver. Pay attention. This was the price of not just a slave, but a slave that was crippled and couldn't do any work. People would buy crippled slaves just because they felt sorry for them. So here, 20 pieces of silver. They sold their brother, like he was a piece of trash, for about 8 ounces of silver. That's about $98 today. The brothers are so unfeeling and so filled with hatred for Joseph that they sell him to the merchants and they watch him hauled away. Can you imagine watching him being hauled away as a common slave, and they go about their business? Psalms talks about Joseph. Psalm 105 verse 17 tells us that Joseph's experience as a slave was anything but pleasant. It was not pleasant. Don't miss this. Again, Joseph here is a picture of Jesus Christ. He was hated by his brothers. He was betrayed by someone who should have loved him. He was betrayed for a price of a slave. He was sold for some silver. But what did Jesus do? He loved us so much that he endured that hatred, and he died for us. And so the finishing touches begin to unfold at home, and when they gave their father the torn, bloody coat of many colors, leaving Jacob to conclude that his son is dead, it plunged him into inconsolable sorrow. He said, I can't go on. Look at verse 31. Verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, dipped the tunic in the blood, and they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not? Jacob recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son for many days. And all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Can you imagine what Jacob was going through? Some of you can. Your child has died, and he thought he was dead. How do you go on? How do you move ahead? Jacob was distraught. And so he falls in this depths of despair, and he refuses to be comforted. And these cold, calloused men have their broken father's heart, and they don't even care. These cold men reveal their hypocrisy by trying to comfort their father. Let's just comfort him and pretend it's all okay. Not a single one of those cowards had the courage to stand up and tell Jacob the truth. And for years and years and years, he had no idea. But their father, in the end, was in better shape than they were. He lived every day with grief. They lived every day with guilt. The knowledge of what they had done aided them until they faced Joseph with the truth years later. That's the power of guilt. It will eat at you until the problem is dealt with clearly. The best thing you and I can do with wrongs that we've done, and we've all done wrongs to people, is to make them right.